At 4:20 in the afternoon on June 6, 1944, Colonel Hermann Oppeln-Bronikowski stood in the turret of his Panzer Mark IV, watching smoke rise from Caen's shattered bridges. He commanded the 22nd Panzer Regiment, 124 tanks of Germany's 21st Panzer Division. For 14 hours, his unit had waited for orders to move. 14 hours while American paratroopers dropped behind Utah Beach, 14 hours while British gliders seized bridges over the Orne River, 14 hours while Allied naval guns pounded the Atlantic Wall defenses. Now, finally, at 4:20 in the afternoon, more than 10 hours after the first Allied soldier touched French soil, Oppeln-Bronikowski's panzers were rolling north toward the invasion beaches. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you're watching from today. 10 miles separated his position south of Caen from Sword Beach, where British troops were pushing inland. Under normal conditions, Oppeln-Bronikowski's regiment could cover that distance in 30 minutes, but June 6, 1944, was not normal. Every bridge over the Orne had been damaged or destroyed by Allied bombing. His tanks had to funnel through Caen itself, squeezing across the few remaining intact spans, while British fighter bombers circled overhead. The column moved at walking pace. Oppeln-Bronikowski, a skilled panzer commander, known equally for aggressive tactics and heavy drinking, had commanded armored forces on the Eastern Front. He understood that speed determined whether counterattacks succeeded or failed. Delay meant giving the enemy time to consolidate positions, bring up reinforcements, establish anti-tank defenses. Every hour that passed transformed a vulnerable beachhead into a fortified position. At that exact moment, approximately 6,000 American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division were already on the ground west of Utah Beach. They had landed between 00:48 and 01:40 hours that morning. Scattered by weather, disoriented by darkness, many had dropped miles from their intended zones, but they had been fighting for over 15 hours, securing causeway exits that allowed troops landing on Utah Beach to push inland without facing murderous fire from German positions commanding the flooded approaches. The paratroopers had not waited for orders to move. They had not spent the morning seeking approval from higher headquarters. They had jumped from their C-47 transports and begun fighting within minutes of touching ground. This disparity between German armored reserves, requiring most of a day to reach the invasion beaches, and American reinforcements arriving within the first hour, represented more than tactical difference. It revealed a fundamental structural failure in German defensive planning. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had predicted this failure. He had warned his superiors repeatedly that Allied air supremacy would prevent the kind of mobile armored response that German doctrine required. He had argued that panzer divisions needed to be positioned directly behind the coast, close enough to counterattack immediately when invasion came. He had lost that argument. The disagreement between Rommel and his commander, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, over armored doctrine had defined German defensive planning since late 1943. Rundstedt, who commanded all German forces in Western Europe, believed in classical military doctrine, maintained strong reserves in central positions. When the enemy reveals his main effort, concentrate overwhelming force and destroy the beachhead in a decisive counterattack. He positioned Panzer Group West, a newly created armored command under General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg, near Paris and Rouen. From that central location, panzer divisions could move toward either the Pas-de-Calais or Normandy, depending on where the invasion actually came. Rommel considered this strategy suicidal, given Allied air power. He had fought in North Africa, where British and American aircraft had dominated the battlefield. He had watched entire German columns destroyed from the air, unable to maneuver or concentrate, because fighter bombers struck anything that moved in daylight. Moving armored divisions 200 miles under hostile air superiority was not a military operation, Rommel argued. It was a massacre. The panzers would arrive at the invasion beaches piecemeal, exhausted, depleted, unable to deliver the concentrated blow that doctrine required. Rommel wanted panzer divisions positioned within 5 to 10 miles of likely landing beaches, close enough that they could reach the coast within an hour of invasion starting, close enough that Allied air power would not have time to interdict their movement, close enough to hit Allied forces while they were still disorganized, still vulnerable, still struggling through the surf with heavy equipment. Stop the invasion at the waterline, Rommel insisted, or lose the war. When the dispute reached Adolf Hitler, he imposed a compromise that satisfied neither field marshal and served German interests poorly. Rommel received operational control of 3 panzer divisions. Only one, the 21st Panzer Division, was positioned near Normandy, stationed southeast of Caen. 2 others, the 2nd and 116th Panzer Divisions, were held north of the Seine River. 3 more divisions remained with Panzer Group West, near Paris, but these came under Hitler's direct control. They could not move without his explicit personal authorization. This command structure guaranteed delay. When invasion came, tactical commanders could not commit forces immediately. They needed approval from Army Group headquarters. Army Group needed approval from the Wehrmacht High Command. High Command needed to wake Hitler, brief him, convince him the invasion was real and not a diversion, then wait for his decision. The system was designed for methodical deliberation rather than rapid response. It assumed time existed for careful analysis. But modern amphibious warfare destroyed that assumption. When thousands of troops landed simultaneously across 50 miles of coastline, speed mattered more than deliberation. The Americans understood this principle through recent experience. At Sicily in July 1943 and at Salerno in September 1943, airborne drops and amphibious landings had occurred within hours of each other. Paratroopers seized key terrain, blocked enemy movement, created chaos behind coastal defenses. Seaborne forces landed while Germans were still reacting to airborne attacks. The combination gave Allied forces a foothold before German reinforcements could organize effective counterattacks. For Normandy, American planners refined this approach. Paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would drop hours before dawn, securing exits from Utah Beach and blocking German routes toward the landing area. When assault troops came ashore at 0630, pathways inland would already be partially cleared. Enemy reinforcements would already be engaged by American forces in their rear areas. The plan faced enormous risks. Dropping 13,000 paratroopers in darkness over enemy territory invited catastrophic losses. Weather could scatter the drops. Anti-aircraft fire could destroy transport aircraft. German patrols could capture disoriented paratroopers before they assembled into fighting units. But the alternative was worse. Without airborne operations, troops landing at Utah Beach would face intact German defenses with clear fields of fire across causeways through deliberately flooded terrain. Casualties would be devastating. Major General Maxwell Taylor commanded the 101st Airborne Division. At 43 years old, he was a career officer from Missouri who had taken command of the Screaming Eagles only in March 1944. Taylor understood that his division would be scattered on landing. Rehearsals had shown that even under ideal conditions, paratroopers dropped over unfamiliar terrain in darkness ended up miles from intended zones. Combat conditions would be worse. His plan accounted for dispersion. Each regiment had specific objectives, causeways and road junctions and bridges, but individual soldiers were trained to fight independently, joining whatever unit they encountered first, attacking whatever targets presented themselves. The 101st would not fight as a coordinated division on June 6th. It would fight as hundreds of small groups, each causing problems for Germans trying to respond to the invasion. The 82nd Airborne Division, under Major General Matthew Ridgway, had similar objectives. Farther west, seize crossings over the Merdere River, capture the town of Sainte-Mère-Église, block German forces stationed on the Cotentin Peninsula from reinforcing the beaches. Like Taylor, Ridgway expected heavy casualties and wide dispersion. Like Taylor, he trained his men to operate independently in small groups. At 0048, on June 6, 1944, the first C-47 transports crossed the Normandy coast carrying elements of the 101st Airborne. 3 regiments, each numbering approximately 1,800 men, jumped between 0048 and 0140. They landed in fields and orchards, in flooded meadows and hedgerows, on roads and in villages. Some drowned in flooded areas. Some landed directly on German positions and were killed before unclipping their parachutes. Many landed far from assigned drop zones, disoriented, alone, surrounded by enemy territory. But they began fighting immediately. Small groups formed around whoever landed nearby, officers and enlisted men from different units working together toward the nearest objective. By 300 hours, less than 2 hours after the first jumps, American paratroopers had engaged German defenders across a 10-mile front. By 0400 hours, elements of the 101st had seized causeway exits at Popeville. By 0730, they had linked up with troops from the 4th Infantry Division landing at Utah Beach. The contrast with German response timing was stark. At 0120, the German 7th Army received notification that Allied paratroopers had landed. Reports were confused, contradictory. Dummy parachutists dropped in multiple locations convinced some commanders that scattered drops represented misdirection rather than focused assault. Real paratroopers landing far from intended zones reinforced the impression of chaos without clear objective. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, commanding all forces in the West, received initial reports around 0200 hours. He did not believe a major invasion was underway. Allied deception operations had convinced the German High Command that the main landing would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point between England and France. Normandy drops might be diversionary, intended to draw German reserves away from the real invasion site. Even when radar detected the massive Allied naval fleet approaching Normandy at 0200 hours, German commanders remained uncertain. Was this the invasion, or elaborate feint preceding the real assault somewhere else? The decision about committing armored reserves could not be made hastily. Commit forces to Normandy, and the real invasion at Calais would succeed unopposed. Hold reserves, and Normandy might collapse before reinforcements arrived. General Alfred Jodl, operations officer at Hitler's headquarters, refused to wake the Führer. Hitler had worked late and was not to be disturbed before mid-morning. Without Hitler's authorization, the 4 panzer divisions held in strategic reserve could not move. Through the early morning hours of June 6, while American paratroopers fought for causeway exits and British glider troops seized bridges over the Orne, German armored reserves waited for orders that would not come until Hitler woke, received briefings, and made his decision. The 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit under direct control of Army Group B, and thus not requiring Hitler's personal authorization, spent the early morning fighting British paratroopers near the Orne bridges. General Edgar Feuchtinger, the division commander, had been away from his headquarters when paratroopers landed. He arrived at his command post at 0520, more than 4 hours after the first Allied soldiers touched French soil. Feuchtinger faced contradictory orders. Should his division clear paratroopers from the Orne bridges? Should it move toward the beaches where seaborne landings had begun at 0630? Should it wait for coordination with other units? General Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps, wanted the 21st Panzer to head for the beaches immediately, but the division belonged to Army Group B, so Marx needed approval from Rommel's headquarters. Rommel was not there. He had returned to Germany on June 4th to visit his wife for her birthday and to meet with Hitler about obtaining additional panzer divisions for Normandy. In Rommel's absence, Colonel Hans Speidel, his chief of staff, had to make decisions. Speidel was cautious, unwilling to commit forces without a clear picture of Allied intentions. Radio messages went back and forth between Marx and Speidel while the 21st Panzer remained stationary. Not until noon, more than 5 hours after Allied troops began landing on the beaches, did Marx finally receive clear authorization to commit 21st Panzer Division. Feuchtinger immediately ordered his tanks to cross the Orne, move through Caen, and drive north to the sea. But moving armor through a city under air attack consumed time. Every bridge had to be checked for damage. Every street risked destruction from naval gunfire or fighter-bomber attacks. The division took 3 full hours to cover 10 miles from staging areas southeast of Caen to positions north of the city. At 4:20 in the afternoon, Oppeln Bronikowski's 22nd Panzer Regiment finally began its attack towards Sword Beach. Confidence ran high among the German tankers. They were veterans who had fought in North Africa. They understood armor tactics. They knew how to maneuver, how to coordinate with infantry, how to exploit gaps in enemy lines. British forces that had landed that morning were still organizing, still consolidating positions, still vulnerable to coordinated armored assault. But 14 hours had passed since invasion began. Those 14 hours had fundamentally changed the tactical situation. British troops were no longer struggling in the surf. They had pushed inland. They had brought up anti-tank guns. They had established defensive positions with clear fields of fire. Most critically, they had positioned 17-pounder anti-tank guns, weapons that could penetrate German tank armor at extended ranges. The 22nd Panzer Regiment attacked in 2 groups. Oppeln Bronikowski led the main force of 35 Mark IV tanks toward Perrier Ridge, high ground that dominated the approach to Sword Beach. A second group of similar size moved toward Point 61. Both groups expected to overrun British positions quickly and reach the coast, where they could attack landing beaches from positions overlooking the shoreline. Both attacks failed within minutes. British Sherman Firefly tanks, mounting 17-pounder guns, opened fire from concealed positions. The first German Mark IV exploded before returning fire. Within minutes, the lead group lost 6 tanks. The second group lost 10. German tanks that survived the initial ambush tried to maneuver, but British positions were well sighted, covering all approaches with overlapping fields of fire. By 600 hours in the evening, the 21st Panzer Division's counterattack had been decisively defeated. 16 tanks destroyed, approximately 70 damaged or disabled. The division never recovered its offensive capability. What might have succeeded if launched at 0700 hours that morning, hitting British forces while they were still on the beaches, had become impossible by late afternoon when the British had built a coherent defense. The timing disparity told the story. American paratroopers had jumped at 0048. They engaged German forces by 0300. They secured key objectives by 0730. Total elapsed time from arrival to mission accomplishment, less than 7 hours, most of that spent actually fighting rather than waiting for orders. German armored reserves received alert at 0200. They received authorization to move at 1200. They reached attack positions at 1620. Total elapsed time from alert to attack, more than 14 hours. Time spent fighting, less than 2 hours before being defeated. This was not an isolated incident confined to June 6th. The pattern repeated across the Normandy campaign. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and the Panzer Lehr Division, both elite formations, held in strategic reserve, received Hitler's authorization to move at approximately 1300 hours on June 6th. Both divisions were ready to move at 0600. 7 hours, they waited for permission while Allied forces consolidated beachheads. When finally authorized to move, both divisions faced immediate problems. Allied air superiority meant movement in daylight was suicidal. Fighter bombers destroyed anything on the roads. Panzer Lehr Division lost 5 tanks and 84 half-tracks to air. Attacks during its approach march to Normandy. The 12th SS lost substantial vehicles and equipment. Neither division reached combat positions until June 7th, more than 24 hours after invasion began. By the time these elite formations arrived, the window for destroying the Allied beachhead had closed. The 2nd Panzer Division, stationed north of the Seine River and theoretically able to reach Normandy quickly, did not receive movement orders until late afternoon on June 6th. The division began its approach march that evening, moving under cover of darkness to avoid air attacks. It took 3 full days to reach combat positions near Caen, arriving on June 9th. 3 days, during which Allied forces had landed hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of vehicles, and established supply lines that stretched from the beaches deep into Norman countryside. The strategic reserve system that German High Command had created for defending France had proven catastrophically inadequate. Designed for deliberate response to threat, it could not cope with the speed of modern amphibious assault. By the time Hitler's headquarters determined where the main invasion was occurring, issued authorization for reserves to move, and those reserves actually reached the battlefield, Allied forces had transformed vulnerable beachheads into fortified positions defended by overwhelming firepower. The American approach represented the opposite philosophy. Authority was pushed down to tactical commanders who could make immediate decisions without seeking approval from distant headquarters. When the 101st Airborne jumped into Normandy, company commanders and even individual soldiers were empowered to take initiative, seize opportunities, accomplish missions without waiting for coordination from higher command. This decentralization carried risks. Small units acting independently might work at cross purposes, duplicate efforts, or miss opportunities for coordinated action. But those risks proved far smaller than the risk of paralysis through over-centralized command. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, part of the 101st Airborne Division. He landed at approximately 01:15 on June 6th, several miles from his intended drop zone. His battalion was scattered across the Norman countryside, small groups separated by hedgerows and German positions. By 0300 hours, Cole had assembled approximately 75 men from his 800-man battalion. Rather than wait for more soldiers to arrive, rather than seek guidance from the regiment or division, Cole immediately began moving toward his assigned objectives. His reduced force attacked German positions at Poopville, a small village controlling Exit 1 from Utah Beach. The fight lasted 3 hours. Cole's paratroopers, vastly outnumbered by the men of their own battalion, who were still scattered across Normandy, overwhelmed German defenders through aggression and initiative. By 0700 hours, Exit 1 was secure. When troops from the 4th Infantry Division landed at Utah Beach at 0630, they found a cleared path inland because Cole had not waited for perfect conditions or full strength before attacking. This pattern repeated across the airborne drop zones. Small groups of paratroopers, rarely numbering more than a few dozen men, attacked targets that doctrinal planning assumed would require company or battalion-sized forces. They succeeded through speed and initiative, hitting German positions before defenders could organize effective resistance. The tactical audacity that American commanders displayed at small unit level, the willingness to attack immediately with whatever forces were available, provided stark contrast to German hesitation at operational level, where divisional and corps commanders waited for authorization and coordination. These systemic differences extended beyond command philosophy to fundamental assumptions about warfare. German doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, the concentrated blow that destroyed enemy forces through superior coordination and firepower. This approach had worked brilliantly during the 1940 French campaign and the early phases of the Russian invasion. It assumed that time existed for preparation, that reserves could be moved and concentrated, that the decisive moment could be identified and exploited through careful planning. American doctrine, forged through experience in the Pacific and Mediterranean theaters, emphasized continuous pressure. Landing forces would establish beachheads quickly, accept higher initial casualties in exchange for momentum, then pour reinforcements ashore faster than defenders could organize counterattacks. The approach was industrial rather than artistic. Americans would accept tactical messiness, incomplete coordination, units fighting in isolation, if that allowed them to maintain operational tempo that prevented enemy response. The naval dimension of this difference was particularly striking. Allied naval forces remained off the Normandy coast throughout June 6th and for weeks afterward, providing fire support that functioned as mobile artillery for ground forces. When Opel Bronikowski's panzers attacked towards Sword Beach at 4:20 in the afternoon, British forward observers called in naval gunfire within minutes. 16-inch shells from battleships offshore devastated German tank formations. The panzers could not maneuver away because British anti-tank guns covered all retreat routes. They could not press attacks because naval gunfire destroyed tanks that advanced. German planning had acknowledged that Allied naval power would dominate the invasion beaches. Rommel had argued precisely this point when advocating for forward positioning of panzer divisions. But the implications of that naval dominance extended far beyond what German planners had anticipated. Allied warships did not simply bombard static defenses during the initial landing phase. They remained on station, available to support ground forces for days and weeks. Any German counterattack toward the coast came within range of naval guns that could deliver tonnage equivalent to multiple artillery divisions. The Luftwaffe's absence compounded German disadvantages. At Sicily, at Salerno, at Anzio, Allied forces had worried about German air attacks on landing beaches. Those attacks never materialized in strength during the Normandy invasion. German aircraft made token appearances on June 6th, but Allied fighters dominated the skies so completely that daylight movement became impossible for German ground forces. The technological and numerical superiority that Allied air forces enjoyed in June 1944 was overwhelming. German fighters that attempted to contest airspace over Normandy were shot down quickly. German bombers attempting to attack the invasion fleet were intercepted before reaching targets. This air supremacy transformed the operational environment in ways that invalidated traditional military calculations. Throughout history, defenders had advantages in mobile warfare. Interior lines allowed them to move forces shorter distances to threatened points. Attackers had to project power across water or through hostile territory, extending supply lines and limiting reinforcement capabilities. But Allied air and naval dominance reversed these traditional relationships. Allied forces could land troops and supplies faster than Germans could bring up reserves because Allied movement occurred under the protective umbrella of fighters and naval guns, while German movement was constantly harassed from the air. The quantitative dimensions of this disparity were staggering. On June 6th alone, Allied forces landed approximately 156,000 troops across 5 beaches spanning 50 miles of coastline. They unloaded 750 vehicles and 5,000 tons of supplies. The logistical achievement represented the culmination of 2 years of planning and preparation, involving specially designed landing craft, artificial harbors, underwater pipelines, and floating docks. German forces in Normandy on June 6th numbered approximately 50,000 troops in static defensive positions, many of them older soldiers or men from occupied territories of dubious reliability. The mobile reserves that were supposed to counterattack and drive Allied forces into the sea numbered approximately 120,000 men organized in several panzer and infantry divisions. But these reserves could not move quickly to the battlefield, could not concentrate their forces, could not deliver the kind of decisive blow that German doctrine required. By June 7th, Allied forces had landed more than 300,000 troops in Normandy. By June 12, the number exceeded 500,000. Each day, more men and equipment poured ashore while German reinforcements struggled to reach the battlefield through a gauntlet of air attacks and naval gunfire. The race to build up forces, which Rommel had identified as critical to determining campaign outcome, was never close. Allied build-up proceeded with industrial efficiency, while German build-up crawled forward in fits and starts. The strategic consequences became apparent within weeks. German forces fought with skill and determination, defending every hedgerow, counterattacking when possible, inflicting heavy casualties on Allied attackers, but they could not win a campaign of attrition against enemies who could replace losses overnight, while German replacements took weeks to arrive. And they could not maneuver when Allied aircraft destroyed anything that moved in daylight. They could not concentrate forces for decisive counterattacks because Allied intelligence detected German movements and Allied air power smashed concentrations before they could attack. The window of vulnerability that Rommel had identified, those first hours when Allied forces were still organizing on the beaches, had closed before German armored reserves could exploit it. By the time the 21st Panzer Division attacked on the afternoon of June 6th, British forces were dug in with anti-tank guns and naval fire support. By the time the 12th SS and Panzerlehr arrived on June 7th and 8th, the beachhead was 20 miles deep, with continuous defensive lines. By the time the 2nd Panzer Division reached Normandy on June 9th, the battle was no longer about preventing the invasion, but about containing it, limiting Allied breakout, trying to stabilize a front that was collapsing under relentless pressure. Hitler's interference in operational decisions proved particularly damaging. His insistence on maintaining personal control over strategic reserves meant that divisions, which should have moved at first light on June 6th, sat idle through the critical morning hours. His conviction that Normandy was a feint preceding the real invasion at Pas-de-Calais meant that even after June 6th, substantial German forces remained in the Calais area, watching for an invasion that never came. The entire 15th Army, comprising 19 divisions, stayed north of the Seine River through June and into July, unable to reinforce Normandy because Hitler believed Allied deception operations suggested a second landing. This deception operation, codenamed Fortitude, represented one of the most successful strategic deceits in military history. Allied planners created a fictitious 1st United States Army group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton and stationed in southeast England, directly across from Pas-de-Calais. Through false radio traffic, dummy equipment, and carefully controlled intelligence leaks, Allied intelligence services convinced the German High Command that Patton's army group of 50 divisions was preparing to invade Calais. The deception was so successful that even after Normandy landings began, German intelligence continued to believe that the main invasion was yet to come. This meant that throughout June and into July, German forces in France remained divided. Units in Normandy fought desperately against overwhelming Allied superiority, while units near Calais waited for an invasion that would never materialize. When German commanders in Normandy pleaded for reinforcements, they were told that reserves had to remain in position to counter the anticipated second landing. The strategic paralysis that resulted from successful Allied deception compounded the operational paralysis that resulted from over-centralized German command structure. Rommel's prediction had proven accurate. Fighting the battle at the waterline, committing armored reserves immediately when invasion began, was the only strategy with any chance of success. The alternative, which German High Command actually implemented, guaranteed defeat. By the time German armor reached the battlefield, Allied forces had consolidated positions that could not be dislodged without massive casualties. The decisive moment passed while German commanders sought authorization, coordinated between headquarters, and waited for Hitler to make decisions. The broader implications extended beyond Normandy to questions about military organization and command philosophy. Centralized command offered theoretical advantages in coordination and resource allocation. Higher headquarters could see the entire battlefield, assess threats across multiple sectors, allocate reserves rationally based on strategic priorities. But centralization came with fatal delays in fast-moving situations where hours mattered more than perfect plans. Decentralized command accepted inefficiency and duplication in exchange for speed and initiative. Small units operating independently would inevitably make mistakes, miss opportunities for coordination, duplicate efforts, but they could act immediately, exploit fleeting opportunities, create problems for enemies faster than those enemies could respond. In modern warfare, where technology had accelerated operational tempo, where air power and mechanization meant that tactical situations changed by the hour rather than by the day, the advantages of decentralization outweighed its costs. The American military, forged through experience in multiple theaters against multiple enemies, had learned this lesson pragmatically. At Guadalcanal, small groups of Marines had operated independently, attacking targets of opportunity without waiting for coordination from higher command. In North Africa, American forces had suffered initial defeats when they tried to match German tactical sophistication, then achieved success by overwhelming Germans with material superiority and operational tempo. In Italy, American commanders learned to accept messy, grinding advances rather than wait for conditions that permitted clean breakthrough operations. By June 1944, this pragmatic approach had matured into a coherent operational philosophy. American forces would never match German tactical elegance or Japanese fanatical determination or British traditional military professionalism. But Americans could move faster, hit harder, accept higher casualties in exchange for momentum, and replace losses overnight through industrial production that dwarfed anything enemies could match. The approach was brutal, expensive, unsubtle. It was also devastatingly effective. The 45 minutes between American paratroopers jumping into Normandy and those same paratroopers engaging German forces represented more than tactical efficiency. It represented a fundamental understanding that modern warfare rewarded speed over perfection, initiative over coordination, action over deliberation. The 6 hours that German armor needed to reach the battlefield represented an opposite philosophy, one that valued careful planning and coordinated execution over rapid response. In the specific circumstances of June 6, 1944, that difference determined the campaign outcome. Allied forces secured beachheads not primarily through superior numbers or equipment, though both mattered, but through superior operational tempo. They landed troops faster than Germans could bring up reserves. They built up combat power faster than Germans could organize counterattacks. They maintained pressure continuously, giving German commanders no time to stabilize lines or prepare coordinated responses. The legend of German military excellence, forged in the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1940 through 1942, had always rested on operational tempo. German forces succeeded by moving faster than enemies could respond, by concentrating overwhelming force at decisive points before enemies could reinforce, by exploiting gaps before they could be closed. At Normandy, Allied forces turned German operational methods against their creators. The masters of mobile warfare found themselves outmaneuvered by enemies who moved with industrial efficiency rather than tactical elegance. When Opel Bronikowski watched his panzers burn on Perrier Ridge that afternoon, when he ordered the retreat that ended Germany's last chance to drive Allied forces into the sea, he understood what had happened. His tanks had arrived too late. The British had dug in too deeply. The naval guns offshore could reach any position his panzers could occupy. The fighter bombers overhead could strike any movement his regiment attempted. The battle was lost, not through lack of courage or skill, but through systematic failure of command structure that had consumed 14 precious hours in deliberation and authorization, while the enemy built defenses that could not be breached. 45 minutes versus 6 hours. The difference measured more than time. It measured two philosophies of warfare, two approaches to command, two visions of how modern armies should operate. History rendered its verdict on the beaches of Normandy, and that verdict proved unambiguous. Speed had triumphed over deliberation, initiative over coordination, pragmatic effectiveness over theoretical elegance. The lesson would echo through military thinking for generations to come. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.